There's a particular kind of laughter that stays with you longer than an insult ever could. The laughter of people who think they're simply stating an obvious truth. The laughter that says, "We're not even being cruel, we're just being honest, and isn't it funny that you don't see it too?" I heard that laughter for the first time at a dinner in my future mother-in-law's dining room, 18 months before my wedding, when I mentioned, as gently and matter-of-factly as I could, that I'd like us to have a prenuptial agreement. My then-fiancé's mother laughed first, a short, surprised bark of a sound, and then his father joined in, and then, worst of all, his younger sister, and for a moment, I sat there at that beautifully set table, surrounded by inherited china and old money candlesticks, feeling smaller than I had felt in a very long time. "Oh, sweetheart," his mother said, once she'd composed herself, reaching over to pat my hand in a gesture that managed to feel both affectionate and deeply condescending at once. "You really don't need to worry about that. This family takes care of its own. A prenup is what people do when they don't trust each other, and we trust you completely." She said it warmly, generously even, as though she were offering me some kind of gift by dismissing my request, as though the very act of wanting legal protection for myself was itself a small insult to the family's honor, an accusation they were graciously choosing to overlook. I want to explain, before I go further, exactly who I was walking into that family as, because it matters enormously for understanding both the mockery that followed and the quiet resolution that eventually came years later. I grew up modestly, the daughter of 2 school teachers who valued careful planning above almost everything else, who taught me from a young age that financial protection wasn't about distrust, it was about basic responsibility. The same way you'd wear a seatbelt not because you expect to crash, but because crashes happen to people who never expected them either. I built a small but genuinely successful graphic design business in my late 20s, working relentless hours to grow it from a one-woman operation running out of my apartment into a studio with 4 employees and a client roster I was genuinely proud of. By the time I met my fiancé, I had real assets of my own, modest by his family's standards but hard-won and entirely mine, built without any help from anyone. My fiancé's family, by contrast, came from generational wealth, the kind that had accumulated over 3 or 4 generations of shrewd real estate investments and careful estate planning, the kind of family where nobody ever really had to worry about money in any practical sense, because there was simply always more of it, somewhere in a trust or a portfolio or a piece of property nobody currently lived in. His mother, Diane, ran the family's various charitable foundations with the brisk efficiency of someone who had never once had to balance a checkbook out of necessity. His father, Richard, had inherited most of his position rather than built it, though he liked to talk about his career in commercial real estate as though it had required the same grit my own business had. His sister, Vanessa, 3 years younger than my fiancé, had never held a job longer than 8 months, drifting between vague, creative pursuits, funded entirely by an allowance that dwarfed what most people earned working full-time. My fiancé himself, David, was different from his family in ways I genuinely loved, more grounded, more curious about the world beyond his own comfortable circle, someone who had actually worked hard in his career as an architect, even though he technically never needed to. It was David's difference from his family that made me fall in love with him in the first place, and it was David's occasional inability to fully separate himself from his family's expectations that would end up mattering more than either of us anticipated. When I first raised the idea of a prenup, months before that dinner where his mother laughed, David himself had been surprisingly receptive, at least initially. He understood, intellectually, why I wanted one. I had built something real with my business, and he respected that enough to understand my desire to protect it. But David also had a lifelong habit of avoiding conflict with his parents, a pattern I'd noticed early in our relationship but hadn't yet understood the full weight of. And when his mother's reaction at that dinner was so dismissive, so wrapped in the language of family trust and loyalty, I watched him gradually retreat from his own earlier support, not reversing his position outright, but softening it, hedging it, letting his mother's framing slowly color how he talked about it too. "Maybe we don't need something so formal," he said to me a few weeks after that dinner, in a tone that was trying very hard to sound reasonable rather than capitulating. "Maybe we could just handle things informally, keep our finances mostly separate without all the legal paperwork. It might be less awkward with my parents. I remember the specific disappointment of that conversation, not because I thought David was being malicious, but because I could see so clearly the shape of what was happening. His family's mockery had worked, at least partially, softening his resolve through nothing more than a well-placed laugh and a patronizing hand pat. I held my ground, gently but firmly, over the following months. I explained to David, repeatedly, that this wasn't about distrust of him specifically. It was about protecting the business I'd built with a decade of relentless work. About ensuring that whatever happened in our future, good or bad, my professional accomplishments would remain unambiguously mine. I also, though I didn't say this part out loud as often, wanted protection specifically because of his family. Because I had watched, over the course of our engagement, small moments that revealed exactly how thoroughly his parents believed that money and control were the same thing. And I didn't want to spend my marriage vulnerable to a family that clearly viewed prenups, and by extension financial independence, as something slightly beneath them, something other people needed because they lacked the family's inherent trustworthiness. The mockery continued, in various forms, throughout the remaining months of our engagement. At a family gathering for David's father's birthday, Vanessa made a comment, loud enough for the room to hear, about how she'd heard I was being so careful with my little business. The word little doing a great deal of quiet, condescending work in that sentence. Richard, on a different occasion, made an offhand remark about how prenups were for people marrying into money who are worried about getting caught. A comment so pointed in its implications that I actually had to leave the room for a few minutes to compose myself before returning to the table. I want to be honest that these comments hurt, genuinely, repeatedly, in ways that accumulated over those 18 months into a kind of quiet, persistent wound. But I also want to be honest that they clarified something for me, sharpened my resolve in a way that, looking back, was probably exactly the opposite of what Diane, Richard, and Vanessa intended. Every time they mocked the idea of a prenup, they revealed, a little more clearly, exactly how they viewed money, control, and the boundaries between family members, and every revelation made me more certain, not less, that I needed the protection I was asking for. David and I eventually did draft a prenuptial agreement, though the process took far longer and required far more careful negotiation than I'd initially anticipated, partly because David kept needing time to work through his own discomfort about going against his family's expressed wishes. The agreement, when we finally finalized it about 4 months before our wedding, was straightforward in its structure. My business, and its future growth remained entirely mine, protected from any claim in the event of a divorce, regardless of how much it grew during our marriage. Any assets I brought into the marriage remained mine. Any assets David brought into the marriage, including his own modest but real portion of an eventual family trust, remained his. We agreed to split fairly, under the agreement's terms, whatever we built together during the marriage itself, jointly acquired property, joint savings, that kind of thing, but the fundamental principle was clear and, I thought, entirely fair. What each of us built independently, before and outside the marriage, stayed independently ours. I remember the specific satisfaction of signing that document, not because I anticipated a divorce, genuinely not. I loved David and fully expected to build a long life with him, but because signing it felt like reclaiming something that his family's mockery had tried, repeatedly, to take from me, the basic right to protect what I'd built without being made to feel small or distrustful for wanting to do so. The wedding itself was, on the surface, lovely, an elegant affair at a venue his family had used for generations of celebrations, filled with relatives and friends, and the particular performative warmth of a family event where everyone knows exactly which version of themselves to present in public. Diane gave a toast that evening about the importance of building a foundation of trust, a phrase that landed, for me, with a bitter irony given her repeated dismissal of the very document that had actually built the foundation I felt secure standing on. The marriage itself, for the first 3 years, was genuinely good, better than good, in many ways. David and I built a life together that felt, mostly, separate from the pressures of his family. Our own apartment, our own routines, our own private jokes and rhythms. My business continued growing steadily during those years, expanding to 6 employees, landing several significant clients that meaningfully increased both its revenue and its reputation in the industry. David's architecture career flourished too, and for a while, it genuinely felt like his family's earlier mockery of my caution had simply become an old, faded memory, a minor unpleasantness from our engagement that no longer mattered much in the actual texture of our daily lives. The strain that eventually led to our divorce didn't come from any single dramatic betrayal, and I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one sometimes get told as though there's always one clear villain, one obvious moment of wrongdoing that explains everything. Our marriage simply, slowly, drifted in ways that are common to a lot of marriages, growing apart gradually rather than breaking suddenly, David's increasing professional demands pulling him toward longer hours and more frequent travel, my own business's growth demanding more of my time and attention too, until we found ourselves, around year 4, living genuinely separate lives under the same roof, polite and cordial, but increasingly disconnected from each other in any deeper sense. What did involve his family, however, and what made the eventual divorce process so illuminating in retrospect, was how Diane and Richard responded once it became clear, around year 4.5, that David and I were heading toward an actual separation. I remember the specific phone call, about 6 weeks after David and I had first, tentatively, honestly, discussed the possibility of divorce between ourselves, when Diane called me directly, her tone entirely different from the warm condescension of our engagement years. "I understand things have been difficult," she said, in a voice that had shifted into something far more clipped and businesslike than I'd ever heard from her before. "But I want to make sure we're all being reasonable about how assets get sorted out here. David's family has significant interests that need to be protected properly." I remember feeling a strange, quiet satisfaction at that phrase, properly protected, coming from the same woman who had once patted my hand and told me that worrying about protection was itself a kind of insult to family trust. I told her, calmly, that David and I had a prenuptial agreement that addressed exactly these questions, the same prenuptial agreement she had laughed at, dismissed, and repeatedly mocked throughout our engagement. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that I actually asked if she was still there. "Right," she finally said, her tone noticeably cooler now. "The prenup. Of course." I don't think she had forgotten it existed, not exactly, but I do think that in the years since our wedding, it had quietly shifted, in her mind, from an unnecessary formality to something she'd apparently never fully absorbed the actual terms of, an inconvenient piece of paperwork she'd dismissed so thoroughly at the time that she'd never bothered to actually understand what it protected, and for whom. The divorce process itself, once it formally began, unfolded with a kind of clean, almost anticlimactic efficiency that surprised both David and me, given how emotionally complicated the preceding months of drifting apart had been. Because the prenuptial agreement was comprehensive, carefully drafted, and unambiguous in its terms, there was remarkably little to actually litigate. My business, now worth significantly more than it had been at the time of our wedding, remained entirely mine, exactly as the agreement specified, its growth during the marriage having no bearing whatsoever on David's claims, because we had explicitly addressed that scenario years earlier, in the very document his family had once found so laughably unnecessary. David's own assets, including his growing stake in various family trusts and properties, similarly remained his, protected from any claim on my part, which, honestly, I had never wanted or expected regardless. Our shared assets, the joint savings we'd built together, the modest condo we'd purchased jointly during our 3rd year of marriage, were divided fairly and straightforwardly according to the agreement's clear terms for jointly acquired property. There were no dramatic legal battles, no contentious months of discovery and depositions, no expensive team of lawyers combing through years of financial records, trying to establish claims neither of us actually had any legal basis to make. The entire process, from the initial filing to the final decree, took under 4 months, remarkably quick for a divorce, involving assets of the size and complexity ours technically involved. I remember, partway through that process, running into Richard at a mutual friend's dinner party, an awkward encounter neither of us had quite anticipated, given the ongoing divorce proceedings. He was noticeably subdued, none of the earlier condescension I remembered from those engagement-era comments about prenups being for people marrying into money who are worried about getting caught. Instead, he said something that, in its own quiet way, felt like the closest thing to an acknowledgement I'd receive from his side of the family. "I have to say," he said, somewhat stiffly, clearly working to find the right words, "that agreement of yours made all of this considerably simpler than it might have been. Cleaner, for everyone." I thanked him, and neither of us said anything more about it. But I understood, in that brief exchange, that he was quietly conceding something he'd once mocked without ever really examining. Vanessa, David's sister, was the one family member who eventually said something closer to genuine acknowledgement, months after the divorce had finalized, at a chance encounter at a mutual acquaintance's gallery opening. "I actually respected what you did. Looking back," she said, somewhat unexpectedly, over a glass of wine neither of us had really expected to be sharing given the circumstances. "At the time it seemed so cold, honestly, like you were planning our brother's failure before the wedding even happened. But watching how smoothly everything got sorted out, compared to some of my friends' divorces, I get it now. You weren't planning for failure, you were just being smart." I appreciated the comment more than I expected to, not because I needed her validation exactly, but because it confirmed something I'd believed all along, that what had been mocked as distrust was, in reality, simply careful, unemotional planning, the same kind of planning her own family had built their entire multi-generational fortune on, just applied, this time, by someone they hadn't expected to be quite so deliberate about protecting herself. David and I, remarkably, remained on genuinely cordial terms throughout and after the divorce, something I attribute at least partly to how little the process itself had to actually fight over. We'd built a life together for several years, and even as that life ended, the ending itself didn't need to be ugly, didn't need to involve the kind of prolonged, bitter legal battle that so often turns divorces into wars of attrition, precisely because we'd made careful, unemotional decisions years earlier, before either of us had any reason to feel emotional about them at all. I've thought, often, in the time since the divorce finalized, about that first dinner at Diane's table, the laughter, the patronizing hand pat, the certainty with which his entire family had dismissed my request as unnecessary, even mildly insulting. I've thought about how thoroughly they seemed to believe, at the time, that their family's wealth and their family's supposed loyalty made careful legal protection redundant, an accusation rather than a reasonable precaution. And I've thought about how differently the entire divorce might have unfolded if I had, in fact, let their mockery talk me out of what I'd originally wanted, if David's early wavering, prompted by his mother's dismissive laughter, had actually won out over my own insistence. My business, the thing I'd built from nothing over a decade of relentless work, remained entirely, unambiguously mine throughout the entire process, exactly as I'd intended when I first raised the idea at that uncomfortable dinner 18 months before my wedding. There was no dramatic confrontation required to secure that outcome, no shouting match, no courtroom battle where I had to fight to prove what was rightfully mine. The protection had already been secured, years earlier, quietly, through careful paperwork rather than emotional confrontation, and the divorce itself simply became the moment that protection was finally, formally activated, exactly as designed. I moved into a new apartment about 2 months after the divorce finalized, a modest but genuinely mine space that felt, in its own quiet way, like a fresh continuation of the life I'd been building even before I met David, rather than some diminished consolation prize after a failed marriage. My business continued growing in the months that followed, actually accelerating in some ways, as though the emotional energy I'd been spending on a slowly dissolving marriage redirected itself naturally into work I'd always found genuinely fulfilling. I don't think of what happened as revenge, and I want to be clear about that distinction, because I think it matters. I never wanted David's family to suffer, or to be humiliated. I never engineered some elaborate scheme designed to prove them wrong, or make them regret their earlier mockery. What actually happened was simpler and, I think, considerably more powerful than any kind of engineered comeuppance. I made a careful, unemotional decision to protect what I'd built, years before I had any reason to need that protection, and when the need eventually arrived, unexpectedly and without any particular drama, that decision simply did exactly what it was designed to do. The mockery I endured beforehand didn't prevent the protection from working. If anything, it only clarified, in hindsight, exactly why that protection had been so necessary in the first place. I still see David occasionally, at mutual friends' gatherings mostly, and our interactions remain genuinely warm, free of the bitterness that so often lingers after a marriage ends. We built something real together for a few years, even if it ultimately didn't last, and I think we both recognize now that the clean, uncomplicated way our divorce unfolded gave us both the space to remember the good years honestly, rather than having them overwritten entirely by a prolonged, ugly legal battle. I think about that dinner at Diane's table more than I probably should. The specific quality of that laughter, the patronizing certainty with which an entire family dismissed something I knew, even then, mattered enormously to my own sense of security and self-respect. I think about how easy it would have been to let that laughter win, to fold under the accumulated weight of 18 months of subtle mockery from people who had never once had to build anything from nothing the way I had. I didn't fold, and years later, when it actually mattered, that decision protected exactly what it was always meant to protect, quietly, cleanly, without anyone ever needing to raise their voice about it at all. If there's a lesson in any of this, and I've turned this over many times since, it isn't really about prenup specifically, or even about divorce. It's about trusting your own instincts about what you need to protect, even when the people around you, especially the people who've never had to build anything themselves, insist that your caution is somehow an insult rather than simple, reasonable wisdom. Diane, Richard, and Vanessa mocked a document they never fully understood, dismissed a precaution born from a decade of hard work they'd never had to replicate, and in the end, that same quietly dismissed document became the exact reason their family's divorce with me involved no battle at all, just a clean, careful unwinding of a life that, for a few years, had genuinely been good, ending exactly as fairly as it had been designed to end, long before anyone knew it would need to. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by the kinds of quiet financial and family dynamics so many of us recognize in our own relationships. If any part of it felt familiar to you, tell me in the comments which moment landed hardest, and stay close for the next story in this series, because sometimes the quietest, most carefully drafted decisions turn out to be the loudest kind of protection there is.